Hi, my name is Magdalena and thank you so much for being here because today we are going to be talking about The Catcher in the Rye and the death of John Lennon. So The Catcher in the Rye is a 1951 novel written by American author J.D. Salinger, and aside from several published short stories and novellas, it is his first and only published novel. So it was an immediate success, but the attention and scrutiny led Salinger to becoming a recluse, and thus he published less frequently. But after the release of The Catcher in the Rye, Salinger published a short story collection called 9 Stories in 1953, a volume containing a novella and a short story called Franny and Zoe in 1961, and then a volume containing 2 novellas called Raise High the Roof Beam Carpenters and Seymour an Introduction, and this came out in 1963. His last published work was a novella called Hapworth 16, 1924, which appeared in the New Yorker in 1965. That was the last thing that he ever published, and then he died in January 2010. The illicit and sordid details of Salinger's life are too extensive for this video, but after the release of Hapworth, Salinger didn't publish anything else. According to his widow and son, Salinger wrote all his life, even if he didn't publish it. So, The Catcher in the Rye follows teenager Holden Caulfield as he recalls the events of a long weekend over the Christmas holiday. The story begins at Pensy Preparatory Academy, which is a boarding school in Pennsylvania, and we learn that Holden has recently been expelled from Pensy after failing all of his classes except for English because he is a scholar. On his last night at Pensy Academy, Holden agrees to write an English assignment for his roommate, Ward Stradlater, stupid name. Later that night, they get into a physical altercation for 2 reasons. One, Ward did not like that Holden made the assignment about Holden's younger brother, Allie, who had leukemia a few years ago and died because of it. The second reason is because Ward had gone on a date with a girl named Jane Gallagher, whom Holden previously had a crush on, and Ward refused to disclose whether or not they had sex on this date. So Holden starts a fight, and he loses, obviously, so he decides to catch a train to New York and leave Pensy Prep early because he was tired of all the quote-unquote phonies at the school. And I want you to pay attention to the word phonies because Holden's distaste for phonies is a huge part of the book. So the problem with going to New York is that his parents live in New York and they don't know that he's been expelled, so his plan is to stay away from his family's house until Wednesday, which is when his parents will be notified of his expulsion. It's also worth noting that this is a trend that happens to Holden because he is enrolled in a new boarding school or a new fancy preparatory school every single year, and then every single year he gets expelled for God knows what reason. But this is a trend that certainly his parents will not be happy that they have to find yet another school for him. He arrives in New York, he checks into a hotel, and then he proceeds to dance the night away with 3 tourists in the hotel lounge. These are European tourists. I don't remember which nationality of Europe, but they're European, and that's what I remember. So that same night, Holden also hires a prostitute named Sunny to visit his room despite the fact that he is 1, a virgin, and 2, 16 years old. The reason that he hires Sunny is because he had met Sunny's pimp named Maurice in the elevator earlier that night, and Maurice convinced him to hire Sunny or whatever, and Holden just does. Obviously, they don't have sex because he's 16 years old and he simply doesn't want to have sex right now, but he decides that he still just wants to talk to Sunny, and he's willing to pay her the $5 fee to have her company for the night so that they can talk, but she is pissed off about this even though she's still getting paid to just not do anything, essentially. She leaves, and then she later returns with her pimp, who demands more money aside from the $5 that he already gave her. Holden does not want to do this, but Maurice beats up Holden, they steal his money, and then afterwards Holden thinks of murdering Maurice with a pistol. Obviously, this does not happen. There is no murder in this book. So despite these homicidal fantasies, Holden feels increasingly depressed and desperate for a personal connection because, along with the distaste for phonies that the audience learned very intimately, we also learned that Holden is just a very lonely kid, and he feels like because of all these phonies and because of all these people who put on an act in society to adhere to societal norms, he thinks that there's no one in the world who can really get him because he doesn't think he's a phony, obviously. The next morning, after he gets beaten up by a pimp, he calls a girl named Sally Hayes, and Sally is the kind of girl who he goes out with when they're both bored, but the flip side is that he also calls her the queen of all phonies, which is a little confusing, but unfortunately Holden's desperation for any kind of human connection at this point overrides his distaste for phonies. They spend the afternoon together, and it is okay, but then it's very quickly not a good date. Holden rants against the society simply because he hates his life and he hates the world that he lives in. And then he tries to convince Sally to run away with him into the New England wilderness. And she doesn't like this, and they split for the rest of the day, and they don't see each other for the rest of the book. He calls her at some point, but they don't see each other. After that, Holden goes to a bar and meets up with a guy named Carl Luce? This is how it's spelled. I don't know how to say it. I don't really care. Carl is a student at Columbia University, and he was Holden's student advisor at a previous boarding school, because remember, Holden goes to a new boarding school every single school year. The reason why Holden wanted to meet with Carl is because A, he's lonely, and 2, he suspects that Carl is gay. This is not important to anything that happens in the rest of the book. It is a very insular issue that is contained within this single chapter. But Holden thinks that Carl is gay, and so he tries to bait it out of him because he's got issues, I suppose. And then Holden tries to make some very unkind remarks about Carl's girlfriend, who happens to be Chinese, and Carl simply doesn't find any of this cool. He leaves the bar, and Holden continues to drink, because I guess they just let this 16-year-old, who I'm sure looks like a 16-year-old. I don't know Holden Caulfield. He's a white guy, that's for sure. But he's drinking whiskey, and once he is quite drunk and inebriated, Holden decides to sneak into his own apartment, his parents' apartment building, so that he can see his little sister Phoebe, who is by far the only person Holden actually likes, especially the only person that he likes within his family, because he has 2 parents. It's a very nuclear family situation. He has an older brother named DB, whom Holden used to like because he was a good writer, but then apparently DB sold out to Hollywood, so now he only writes like shitty movies. And Holden doesn't like that because it's a very phony thing to do. And then there's Phoebe, who we're going to talk about, that Holden likes. And then there's dead brother Allie, who died of leukemia. And Holden likes Allie because he, presumably for other reasons, but he mainly likes him because he died young. I don't know anything about. I think he wrote poems. I think that's one of the things that Holden likes, is that he wrote poems that were real and they weren't phony. I don't remember. Holden sneaks into his apartment building so that he can see his little sister Phoebe, and Phoebe just kind of through osmosis finds out that Holden was expelled from school. But when he tries to explain to her why he hates school, she accuses him of hating everything, and he doesn't have a good rebuttal to that. But then they have a heart-to-heart. And Holden tells her all about his fantasy of being the quote-unquote catcher in the rye, which is the title of the book. The catcher in the rye, in Holden's definition, is basically this person who catches little children as they are about to fall off a cliff. And he got this idea from the poem Comin' Through the Rye by Robert Burns because he is good at English. Remember, English was the only class that he didn't fail at Pensy Prep. But then Phoebe proves that he actually isn't very good at English because she tells him that that is not what the poem is about. So Holden starts crying because he fucking hates his life and he hates who he is and he hates the society that he lives in. And Phoebe tries to comfort him, but she's truthfully like 11. She's not in a single digits. She's not a teenager. I think she's about 11 or 12. Maybe 13, but I think that's pushing it. Tries to comfort her crying older brother, but then their parents return home from a Christmas party, so Holden has to flee. Because remember, his parents don't know that he's been expelled from Pensy Prep yet. And the whole point of living in a hotel for a couple of days is so that he doesn't have to tell them sooner. So once Holden leaves the apartment, he visits a former English teacher named Mr. Antolini, who is very concerned for Holden. He's probably the only person who recognizes that Holden is going through some shit right now. Mr. Antolini offers to let Holden sleep on the couch for the night because he is effectively homeless at the moment. Do I know if he still has his room at the hotel? Probably not, because he was robbed by a prostitute and her pimp. Also, where are his things? Is he carrying his things around with him? I don't remember. Holden sleeps on the couch because he's tired and he needs a place to sleep for the night because he's homeless. But then he wakes up like an hour later or something to find Mr. Antolini stroking his head, which is weird because Holden was unconscious, and this is weird. And remember, Holden is 16 years old and Mr. Antolini is his former English teacher. So Holden, I think rightfully so, interprets this as a sexual advance, and it is kind of implied that something like this has happened to him before, not necessarily by Mr. Antolini, but it is suggested that Holden has been in a weird situations like this before. It's suggested that he's been sexually assaulted before in some capacity. Do we know how? No, we do not. The book is not interested in explaining that bit further. So Holden leaves Mr. Antolini's house and he decides to spend the night at Grand Central Terminal, and at that point he has completely lost hope in ever finding a real human connection with someone that he does not deem to be a phony. In that very moment when he is completely isolated and lonely and depressed, he decides to head out west and live as a deaf-mute gas station attendant in a log cabin. And I just want you to let that sink in for you. Okay, I want you to understand that Holden Caulfield's big plan to escape his miserable life is to go out west. That's the first step, because remember, they're in New York. He's got to go out west, because that's what everyone does when they have problems. They go out west. He's going to pretend to be a deaf mute. Cannot speak, he cannot hear. And then he's going to get a good job as a gas station attendant. And then somehow he's going to find a vacant log cabin and live in it. I just want you to think about this for a second, okay? I want you to think about this, I want you to take it in, and then I want you to tell me if this sounds like a plan a 16-year-old would come up with, because I can guarantee you this is surely a plan that only a 16-year-old could come up with. And I want you to know that this does not happen at the end of the book, but it's thought about, and I just need you to know. But instead of immediately going out west to live as a deaf-mute gas station attendant in a log cabin, he decides to meet up with Phoebe at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and she has a suitcase with her because Phoebe's a genius and she figured out that he is going to run away. Does she know where he's going to run away to? No. Only he and we know about his plan to go out west and live as a deaf-mute gas station attendant in a log cabin. But she's like, you're my brother, I want to take care of you, because I love you, because you're my brother, so let's go run away together. But he says no, obviously, because he is a responsible older brother. He says no, she's upset, they're fighting about it, whatever. They go to the Central Park Zoo because they're in Central Park, because if you don't know, the Metropolitan Museum of Art is like literally at Central Park. It's on Central Park, you know? They're very close together. They're like this, okay? They're like this. So they go to the Central Park Zoo and they reconcile after he buys her a ticket to ride the carousel, and this is a very beautiful moment because in this moment he realizes that there's still innocence in the world and that not every single person in the world around him is a phony, because he's watching children and his sister especially ride a carousel and be happy. So then the novel ends with an epilogue of sorts, and it implies that Holden is currently in a mental institution in California and that he has been enrolled in yet another academy that he will be attending in the fall. So thus the cycle continues. So on July 16th, 1951, the front page of the New York Times featured 11 news stories, which I don't really understand. This is a complete tangent, but I don't really understand how they were able to fit 11 news stories on the front page of a newspaper, because if you've seen the front page of a newspaper, it's not big enough to fit that many stories. Even if every single story had a jump page, that's simply too many stories. So the largest headline of the Times that day was about the Korean War, which at that point was a year old, and the headline talked about how peace talks between the United States, not the United States, the United Nations negotiators and communists had resumed in Kaesong. So America, at this point, July 16th, 1951, is not in a great political situation, and the other 10 news stories on the front page of the Times reflected that turbulent political situation. But what does this have to do with The Catcher in the Rye? The New York Times also ran a same-day review of the novel, but this was relegated to the back pages of the Times. Is this simply how the newspaper is laid out and not a deeper indication of the socio-political cultural landscape of 1950s America? Probably. But it would be way too easy if we just stopped there, so we're not going to do that. Because just as the front page of the New York Times exemplified the global struggle between two systems of life, East and West, social and capitalist, you get the picture, the placement of the Times' review for Catcher exemplified the split between the world of culture and the world of politics and society. So in a critical essay that appeared in Critical Inquiry Journal from the University of Chicago, Carol and Richard Oman noted that subsequent reviews published by other news outlets followed the Times' lead in removing Catcher from its political context. They praised the novel as lively and a brilliant tour de force, but nothing else. Reviewers were more concerned with relating Catcher in the Rye to real life, not of politics, but of adolescence, and they tried to rationalize this by bullying Holden Caulfield into a box that was easily understandable and acceptable. So the Omens wrote, "The reviewers differed on certain points. Holden is normal or he is not, but even those who say he is not or possibly not have a norm in mind. They type Holden according to a timeless developmental standard. They do not fully agree on how to define adolescence or on how far Holden fits the category, but they do agree that there is a norm or model and that Holden more or less matches it." The problem with this desire is that, like the Omens stated, reviewers try to define Holden by timeless standards, thereby removing him from the context of the time. And I agree that there are aspects of Holden's personality that are timeless, but the context of the 1950s also feeds into who Holden inherently is. Yes, on the surface, Catcher in the Rye is a deeply apolitical book, as Holden Caulfield has no explicit political opinions. However, if you look past all of the whining that Holden does and the woe is me aspect of his inner monologue, you realize that Catcher is a subtly political novel that reveals the social relationships in mid-century America and motives that sustained them and rationalizations that masked them. So these social relationships, the motives that sustained them and the rationalizations that matched them, revolve around the commodification of power and wealth. Obviously, power and wealth have always been the ultimate form of social currency since the beginning of time, but it reached new heights with the post-war economic boom of the United States because suddenly everyone, by everyone I mean white people, had some semblance of wealth or they had access to wealth. This is the era of the middle class, the nuclear family, rigid gender norms, and the social politics that inform these standards are what Holden Caulfield is rallying against in the novel, even if he doesn't provide explicit information as to how to solve this problem. And this is where his application of the word phony comes in. So the Omens write, Holden's application of the word phony is a good index to what he finds most intolerable in life. The clues of phoniness lie in outward forms of conduct. When a situation or act seems phony to Holden, it evidences bad class relationships or public ritual or both. Phony stigmatizes both the manners and cultures of a dominant bourgeoisie class society and ceremonies and institutions themselves, any society. They add, like Hamlet, Holden stands aghast before a corrupt world. His antagonists are more primarily named American and modern. Holden is seen facing and breaking on forces characteristic of American life and more particularly 20th century American life. Even though Holden isn't explicitly criticizing Truman, who was the president at the time, the novel is an inherent criticism of Truman's America and of 20th century America in general, and as you can probably guess, since this is a time of intense national fervor, people were not very happy about this subtle criticism of their American society and their American behaviors. So by the mid-1950s, The Catcher in the Rye became essential reading material for brooding adolescents, teenagers, college students, the like, and these young people used the book as a manual of how to be disaffected and jaded, especially towards society. It was popular among critics, and it was considered by some scholars to be one of the most influential works in English prose by anyone since Hemingway. I don't really like Hemingway, so I don't really get that. This isn't the time for my opinions on Ernest Hemingway, so we're just going to continue. By the 1960s, the novel became at once the most frequently censored book across the nation, as well as the second most frequently taught book in American public high schools. The campaign against the book was fueled by arguments about its profanity, vulgarity, and spiritual values that could potentially turn children to communism, because again, communism was a big deal during this time period. The Cold War was happening. Communists were everywhere. Commie spies. I shouldn't say that. In the inaugural issue of Rampart, which is a literary quarterly born outside of San Francisco in 1962 for mature American Catholics, American writer Robert O. Bowen complained that not only was Salinger anti-Catholic, but he was also pro-Jewish, pro-Negro, anti-army, and anti-American. Yikes. Although Ramparts ended up moving away from religion and towards the freewheeling spirit of the Bay Area in the 1960s, Bowen's statement struck a nerve with people, especially parents who didn't want their children to be swayed away from the bourgeois way of life, everything that Holden views as phony. So the public's negative feelings have since died down, but the ire towards the book itself has redirected its attention towards the action taken by individuals on behalf of the Catcher in the Rye, or rather Holden Caulfield. Primarily the violent actions influenced by Holden's disaffection and his dissatisfaction with American culture. In an essay for the New England Quarterly, American political and cultural historian Stephen J. Whitford noted, "The history of this novel cannot be disentangled from the way that mentally unbalanced have read it. In one instance, the reader is himself fictional. The protagonist of John Fowles's first book, which captures the unnerving character of Salinger's only novel as an index of taste, perhaps of moral taste. In a more class-conscious society than the United States, Fowles's loner finds something repugnant about the recklessness of the privileged protagonist. In a more violent society than England, types like Frederick Clegg might identify with Holden Caulfield's alienation from normal people so thoroughly that they become assassins." He then adds, "The Catcher in the Rye nevertheless has exercised an eerie allure for asocial young men who, glomming on to Holden's estrangement, yield to the terrifying temptations of murder." Notice that Whitfield emphasizes asocial young men. Although women are just as likely to read The Catcher in the Rye, it is men who are more likely to misconstrue the themes of the novel and Holden's personality in order to explain the unfairness of their estrangement from society, as well as to validate the actions they take to rectify the circumstances of their estrangement. This is because there are very few pieces of fiction, if any at all, that men and boys are willing to adapt themselves to and identify with, and this is an aspect of consuming fiction that women and girls are well trained at, because although women have always been the primary audience for American fiction and movies, there are very few girl stories comparable to The Catcher in the Rye. And even now, when fourth wave feminism has gone above and beyond to rectify the sins of our patriarchal past, I think the best comparable girl story is My Year of Rest and Relaxation by Otesha Moshfegh. I haven't read that book, but everything that I've heard about it seems like it could be, I guess, a better comparison to The Catcher in the Rye than anything else, but I digress. Regardless, science suggests that the reason The Catcher in the Rye doesn't incite homicidal tendencies in women is because women haven't experienced a dearth of fiction that mimics their experiences and their feelings like men have, because again, women can adapt to male stories in ways that men are unable or unwilling to adapt to female stories. And even if women don't identify with the male-centric story, they're able to understand the thematic significance of the story. Furthermore, scientifically speaking, women are more emotionally logical than men, so even if a woman is as asocial and disaffected as a man is, women are able to better rationalize these emotions in a reasonable and mature way that doesn't involve inflicting violence upon other human beings. Which leads us to John Lennon. So John Winston Lennon was born October 9th, 1940 in Liverpool, England. He was the only child of Julia and Alfred Lennon. His father was a merchant seaman and was often absent from John's life, but he still financially provided for the family until February 1944 when the checks just stopped coming and he deserted his post suddenly. He returned home 6 months later, but it was too late because Julia at this time was already pregnant with another man's child. So the two of them divorced. John's maternal aunt Mimi took custody of John. So he lived with Mimi for the rest of his childhood and adolescence. So in July 1946, Alfred took John to Blackpool, which is a seaside resort town in Lancashire, England, as a sort of father-son bonding trip, but Alfred was secretly planning on kidnapping John and emigrating to New Zealand with him. Julia somehow found out and she followed them to Blackpool. They argued and Alfred at that point forced 5-year-old John to choose between the two of them right then and there, which is a fucked up thing to do. John lived with his aunt Mimi and her husband for the rest of his childhood and adolescence, so he clearly didn't pick either of them. In 1956, when John was 15, Julia bought him his first guitar, and this is a significant point in their relationship because Julia was very, very supportive of his music aspirations, whereas Mimi was skeptical. Because Mimi didn't think that John would be able to get rich and famous off of playing music, because that was John's goal. He wanted to be rich and famous from playing music, and Mimi didn't think that was going to happen, but Julia believed in him. So their relationship was kind of built on that, and they started to rekindle their mother-son relationship. On July 15th, 1958, Julia was struck by a car and killed instantly after visiting John at Mimi's house. Whether or not she was directly outside of the house when this happened or she was a little bit away, I don't know. But the event traumatized John to the point of alcoholism and onset violence. Remember, he's like 17 at this point. And around this time, he started dressing like a teddy boy, which is a British youth subculture in the 1950s and 60s in which boys would wear clothes inspired by the dandies of Edwardian England, but they were also really interested in American rock and roll and R&B because they contain multitudes. John identified at this time with people such as Marlon Brando and Elvis Presley, and he really tried to present himself as being very tough and a street kid from the wrong side of the tracks, even though he was a born and bred middle-class suburban kid. There's a lot of issues here. Jumping back a little bit, in 1956, in September, John formed a skiffle group. It's kind of music, I don't know. Skiffle is a kind of music. But he formed a group called the Quarrymen, and by 1957, Paul McCartney and George Harrison had joined the group. John noted in a much, much later interview, he's worked with a ton of different people and a ton of different musicians, but he's only handpicked, selected 2 people to work with. One is Paul McCartney, the other is Yoko Ono. So just take that as you will. Just take it in, embrace it, think about it. Okay. John brought Paul into the band, and then Paul brought George, and then in 1962, George brought Ringo, but then in 1960, just move a little bit back further, 1960, the Quarrymen changed their name to the Beatles. Ringo Starr joins the band as their drummer in 1962, and this, John, Paul, George, Ringo, this completed the 4-piece lineup that would remain until the group broke up in 1970. So by 1962, the band was a major critical and commercial success, and their entire existence kind of changed the way not only music and the music industry worked, but the relationship between Britain and America. Because remember, at this time there was something called the British invasion, and the Beatles were at the forefront. They were like, yes, we are bringing the Brits to America and you are going to love us. Their popularity grew into this intense fan frenzy known as Beatlemania, and the complete adoration and deity-like worship of fans towards the 4 Beatles was likened to that of intense religious fervor and also female masturbation fantasy. There were some fans that believed the Beatles, either as a collective or as individuals, or both maybe, they possessed supernatural healing powers. Is this true? I highly doubt it, but it's fun to think about. The fan fervor got to a point where in 1966, John remarked, rather controversially too, that the group had become more popular than Jesus. So just take that in.
If it had said television is more popular than Jesus, I might have got away with it. But as I just happened to be talking to a friend, I used the word Beatles as a remote thing, not as what I think, as Beatles as though those other Beatles, like other people say it. I just said they are having more influence on kids and things than anything else, including Jesus. But I said it in that way, which is the wrong way. Yeah.
Well, some teenagers have said, have repeated your statements that the Beatles, I like the Beatles more than Jesus Christ. What do you think about that?
Well, originally I was...
By early 1964, the Beatles were international stars and had become a leading force in the British invasion of the United States pop market, like I mentioned before. They were integral to the development of 1960s counterculture, thanks to their roots in skiffle. Again, it's a music genre I know nothing about. It doesn't make any sense to me. But they had their roots in skiffle, beat, and 1950s American rock and roll, as well as their later exploration into folk music, Indian music, and psychedelia. They were, as you might know, very interested in psychedelic drugs and Eastern spirituality in like the second half of their tenure as a band. To this day, the Beatles are the best-selling music act of all time. I could talk for a long time about the success that the Beatles experienced, but we simply do need to move on. John met Yoko Ono, who is a Japanese multimedia artist and peace activist. She is still very much alive, thank you very much. They met on November 9th, 1966, which is the same year that he declared that the Beatles were perhaps more popular than Jesus. 1966 is also coincides with the time that John started taking LSD on the regular. Are these two events mutually exclusive? No, they are not, but I do think it does provide some context as to who John was at this time. John meeting Yoko, I personally think, was the catalyst for his political activism. Like, he wasn't a conservative, I don't think. Just from, like, his outward appearance, I don't think he was a conservative, but he definitely wasn't, like, a socialist or anything. I don't think he was a socialist, even with Yoko. I actually don't really care about their political identities, but whatever. Before meeting Yoko, he was, like I said, involved in the counterculture movement and in youth culture, and he did have an interest in Eastern spirituality prior to meeting Yoko. But once John and Yoko became a thing, he became a big anti-war advocate. The two of them publicly protested the Vietnam War to the point where the Nixon administration tried to have him deported because he was living in New York at the time. I think the Nixon administration tried to have him deported for a number of things. None of them worked out because he continued to live in New York City. Also, at this time, he apologized for his demeaning treatment of women because he was an abusive misogynist, especially to his first wife, Cynthia. He was also just negligent of their son, Julian. I don't think I need to say anything more about that. He was also very vocally anti-fascist, and he became very politically, sexually, economically, socially conscious post-Beatles. But what the hell does John Lennon have to do with The Catcher in the Rye?
Well, if you want to pick it up from the night, I was standing there with a gun in my pocket.
Knew you were going to shoot him?
Sorry?
Knew you were going to shoot him?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Tried not to, praying not to, but knowing down deep it was probably going to come to that.
Did you know it would be that night? Did you know you would see him again?
Yes, I knew that morning, oddly, when I left the hotel, I had some type of premonition that this was the last time I was going to leave my hotel room. I hadn't seen him up to that point. That's what makes it interesting. I wasn't even sure he was in the building. And then I left the hotel room, bought a copy of The Catcher in the Rye, signed it to Holden Caulfield from Holden Caulfield, and wrote underneath that, "This is my statement," underlining the word "this," the emphasis on the word "this." I had planned not to say anything after the shooting. I was right in front of John Lennon there instantly, and I had a black Bic pen, and I said, "John, would you sign my album?" And he said, "Sure." Yoko went and got into the car, and he pushed the button on the pen and started to get it to write. And then he wrote his name, John Lennon, and then underneath that, 1980. And he looked at me, as I mentioned earlier, he said, "Is that all? Do you want anything else?" And I felt then and now that he knew something subconsciously that he was looking into the eyes of the person that was going to kill him.
On the evening of December 8th, 1980, John was shot and fatally wounded in the archway of the Dakota, his New York City residence. He was killed by a man named Mark David Chapman, whom John had met earlier that evening while on his way to a recording session. Who is Mark David Chapman? According to Chapman, he allegedly lost interest in the Beatles after Lennon had declared in 1966 that the Beatles were more popular than Jesus. And this offended Chapman because he had recently converted to Christianity. I think he recently converted to Christianity. The sources I read were a little bit unclear about what his relationship to Christianity was at the time, but he had a relationship with Christianity, and as you know, the Christians did not take offense to John stating that the Beatles were more popular than Jesus, because they notoriously do not take offense to anything. They're a very chill group of people. Chapman also claimed that the lyrics of John Lennon's songs God and Imagine enraged him because in the song God, Lennon states that he does not believe in the Beatles or God or Jesus, that he only believes in him and Yoko. I'm sure you can understand why a Christian would be offended by this. And then in the song Imagine, Lennon states, "Imagine no possessions," and Chapman found this point to be deeply hypocritical because of how rich John was and how lavish his lifestyle was. So Chapman later said that he told us to imagine no possessions, and there he was with millions of dollars and yachts and farms and country estates, laughing at people like me who had believed the lies and bought the records and built a big part of their lives around his music. So because of this, Chapman concluded that Lennon was a phony. Oh, wait, that word sounds familiar. Huh, where did he get that idea from? He got it from The Catcher in the Rye and Holden Caulfield, whom Chapman wished to model his life after. Bad choice. Like millions of readers across the country, Chapman believed the novel was written for him with the sole purpose of addressing his problems and easing his pain. He had a copy of the book in his pocket when he murdered John Lennon, and in the book he wrote, "To Holden Caulfield, from Holden Caulfield, this is my statement." Kind of iconic. It is reported that after Chapman shot John, and while he was waiting for the police to arrive, he sat down on the curb and started reading the novel, which I don't believe he was reading the novel. I think he truly just had the book open to a page and he would just flip the pages intermittently. I do not think that he was reading that book, especially since it was chaos. He just shot a guy, and not just any guy, he shot John Lennon. And you think that he's going to be able to ignore the chaos that's happening around him to read The Catcher in the Rye? I don't think so.
I was stunned. I didn't know what to do. I took the Catcher in the Rye out of my pocket. I paced. I tried to read it. I just couldn't wait, Larry, until those police got there. I was just devastated.
Chapman was arrested, and allegedly he said to the police 3 hours after John was declared dead, "I'm sure the big part of me is Holden Caulfield, who is the main person in the book. The small part of me must be the devil." Juicy. In February 1981, Chapman sent a handwritten statement to the New York Times urging everyone to read The Catcher in the Rye, and he called it an extraordinary book that holds many answers. Why is he being allowed to send mail to the New York Times when he is in jail? Then on August 24th, during his sentencing, Chapman read a passage from The Catcher in the Rye, and this was his sole attempt to justify his murder of John Lennon. Why is he being allowed to read a passage from a book he had at the crime scene? I simply think we should get him away from this book. The passage is, "I keep picturing all these little kids playing some game in this big field of rye and all. Thousands of little kids and nobody's around, nobody big I mean, except me. And I'm standing on the edge of some crazy cliff. What I have to do, I have to catch everybody if they start to go over the cliff. I mean, if they're running and they don't look where they're going, I have to come out from somewhere and catch them. That's all I do all day. I'd just be the catcher in the rye and all." One theory people have put forth is that Chapman viewed John as being a corrupter of innocence, and we can point back to his dislike of John's stance against religion and material possessions, as well as his general demeanor towards substances, nudity, and any form of sin as evidence. There has also been speculation by some that Chapman murdered John because he wanted to preserve John's innocence through death, because the only way one can remain innocent forever is by being dead, and he allegedly believed that John was on the verge of being corrupted, and people who believe this theory or whatever have connected this to Holden's brother Ali, who, remember, died of leukemia. But Ali died young, and Holden seemingly revered honors him in a way, kind of because of this. Not because he died, but because he's innocent and not a phone like everyone else. They've also connected this to Holden's older brother DB. DB was mentioned very briefly in the novel, but by Holden's standards, DB is the pinnacle of innocence gone bad because he is the great writer who sold out for material gain. And in Holden's eyes, commercial success at the expense of artistic integrity is the most sinister form of phoniness. And if you remember, Ali was also a poet. Because he died young, he never got the chance to quote-unquote sell out for commercial gain, thereby losing artistic integrity. Part of the charm of the Beatles during their early years was their unwillingness to compromise their artistic integrity for commercial gain, and even though the band did financially benefit from their quote-unquote rebellion, it wasn't at the expense of their creativity. Once the band broke up, John released a number of brilliant but kind of strange albums before disappearing from the public eye in order to raise his son that he had with Yoko. Author Daniel M. Stashauer speculates that Chapman liked how John stuck to his guns artistically before becoming a recluse, because this is a sentiment that Holden promotes when he suggests to Sally that they disappear together. It is also a sentiment he promotes when he comes up with the plan to move west and become a deaf-mute gas station attendant living in a log cabin. And it's also a sentiment that Salinger himself promoted because he preferred to isolate himself in his home in New Hampshire. So once John came back into the public eye in a big way in 1980, he seemingly catered towards and performed for commercialism, and Stashauer suggests that Chapman may have perceived a threat to the Salinger credo and a crack in the wall that protected Lennon's splendid innocence. Again, this is only speculation, and we might never know Chapman's true reason for killing John Lennon simply because he is genuinely mentally ill, and as a result he has given several contradictory statements as justification for John's murder. I think an interesting component about the situation that isn't talked about nearly enough is the toxic parasocial relationship and ideation Chapman clearly had towards John, and we don't have time to unpack the dangers of using celebrities as vessels to contain, repress, transform our societal configurations of personhood, sexuality, desire, culture, modernity, what have you. Which is really ironic because John Lennon gave an interview 3 days before he was killed, and one of the questions the interviewer posed is in regards to how there is a connective through line in John's work that inspires people to be themselves and to come together and try to change things, implying that John is some sort of messianic leader. That's kind of the implication of the question. But John replies, "I'm not claiming divinity. I've never claimed purity of soul. I've never claimed to have answers to life. I only put out songs and answer questions as honestly as I can, but only as honestly as I can. No more, no less. I cannot live up to other people's expectations of me because they're illusionary." Illusionary? Illusionary. You get the point. Despite this, the theory that Chapman murdered John Lennon for the purpose of maintaining his quote-unquote innocence has, in a roundabout way, been proven true. John Lennon was 40 years old at the time of his death, and the event has become representative of loss in modern culture. And obviously we don't know what John Lennon's reputation would be like if he hadn't been murdered by Chapman, and we don't know if The Catcher in the Rye would have developed a better reputation if Chapman hadn't used it as a source of inspiration, or if the novel would have simply faded away from public perception as many pieces of art do. But John has since become one of the most famous objects of mourning, as well as a figure of idealization thanks to his association with the Beatles. He's been championed as a poet, a musician, avant-garde artist, political radical, a world peace advocate, but he's also been condemned as a self-destructive, angry, depressed fraud and a phony, and this is all because of The Catcher in the Rye. Anyways, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you liked it. Like, subscribe, and I'll see you later.